I can still remember my name. This is important. This is the thing I cling to as the changes accelerate, as my flesh rebels against the shape it has held for 37 years, as the bones beneath my skin twist and crack and reform into configurations that no human skeleton was ever meant to assume. I can still remember my name, and as long as I can remember my name, I am still, in some small, desperate way, myself. I am still the man I was before I made the choices that led me here, before I spoke the words that cannot be unspoken, before I accepted gifts that I did not understand from powers I should never have trusted. My name is Carden Voss. I was a sergeant in the 114th Cadian Shock Troops. I served the Emperor for 19 years before I betrayed him, and I have served the Dark Gods for 3 years since. And now, in these final hours, while language still holds meaning for me, while my thoughts still flow in patterns that could be called human, I am recording this testimony so that someone, anyone, might understand what I have become and why. Not for forgiveness. Forgiveness is not something I deserve or expect. For warning, for witness, for the faint hope that my damnation might prevent another's. I am becoming a chaos spawn. I can feel it happening even as I speak these words, can feel the gifts of the gods accumulating in my flesh, can feel my humanity dissolving like salt in water, leaving behind only the churning, formless horror that awaits all those who receive too much of the gods' attention. My left arm is no longer an arm. It is a mass of tentacles that move according to wills that are not my own, grasping and releasing, coiling and uncoiling in patterns that seem to follow some terrible rhythm I cannot hear. My spine has sprouted growths that press against the inside of my skin, seeking exit, demanding release. And my face, I have not looked upon my face in days, but I can feel it shifting, can feel the features that once marked me as Carden Voss, sliding and reforming into something that will soon be unrecognizable. This is the fate that awaits all who walk the path I have walked. Not the glory we were promised, not the power we were offered, not the immortality that the whispers spoke of in our weakest moments. This is the truth that the cults do not teach, that the champions do not speak of, that the dark gods themselves find amusing in their terrible, alien way. For every warrior who ascends to demonhood, for every champion who earns the gods' true favor, 10,000 others are reduced to this, mindless, screaming things of mutated flesh, creatures that retain nothing of who they were, except perhaps, in their most lucid moments, a dim awareness of what they have lost. I have seen chaos spawn on the battlefield. Every follower of the dark gods has. They lumber alongside our warbands, herded by champions who use them as living weapons, pointed at the enemy, and released to do what their instincts demand. I watched them tear through imperial lines with claws and tentacles and appendages that had no names. Watched them absorb lasfire and bolt rounds without slowing. Watched them kill and kill and kill until there was nothing left to kill, and then turn on each other in their endless, mindless hunger. I pitied them in those days. I thanked the gods that I was not among them. I did not understand that I was already on the path that led to their ranks. Let me tell you how it begins. Let me trace the road that brought me here, so that you might recognize the signs, so that you might turn back before it is too late, so that my suffering might serve some purpose beyond the amusement of entities who have been laughing at human folly since before our species learned to walk. It begins with desperation. It always begins with desperation. The 114th was deployed to Carthax Secundus in the 3rd year of my service as a sergeant. A hive world on the edge of the cicatrix maledictum, close enough to that great wound in reality that the sky itself seemed wrong, that the shadows moved in ways they should not, that every soldier felt the weight of something vast and terrible pressing against the thin membrane of sanity. We were sent to reinforce the planetary defense forces against a cult uprising. A minor action, we were told, a simple matter of purging heretics and restoring imperial order. We were lied to. Or perhaps those who sent us simply did not know. It does not matter now. The cult was not minor. The uprising was not simple. Within 3 weeks of our arrival, the planetary capital had fallen. The governor had been sacrificed on an altar of brass and bone, and the 114th had been reduced from 4,000 soldiers to fewer than 800, fighting a desperate retreat through hive levels that had become charnel houses, surrounded by enemies who seemed to multiply faster than we could kill them. I watched my friends die. I watched men I had served with for years torn apart by things that had once been human, their screams echoing through corridors that had been designed for commerce and habitation, their blood pooling on floors that had once known only the footsteps of workers and families. I watched the commissar put a bolt round through the head of a soldier who had begun to laugh uncontrollably, who could not stop laughing even as his squad mates held him down, who laughed until the explosive round ended his laughter and painted the walls with the contents of his skull. And I began to hear the whispers. They came at night, in the brief hours when exhaustion overcame terror and sleep claimed us despite everything we had witnessed. They came in the spaces between gunfire, in the moments of silence that were somehow worse than the screaming. They came offering comfort, offering strength, offering a way out of the nightmare that our lives had become. I resisted at first. We all did. We were Cadians, born on a world that stared into the eye of terror, raised from infancy, to resist the corruption that seeped from that wound in reality. We knew what the whispers meant. We knew what waited for those who listened. But resistance requires hope. Resistance requires the belief that endurance will be rewarded, that salvation is possible, that the Emperor has not abandoned you in the darkness. And as the weeks stretched into months, as our numbers dwindled and our ammunition ran low, as we ate the dead because there was nothing else to eat and drank recycled water that tasted of blood no matter how many times it was filtered, hope became a luxury we could no longer afford. On the 93rd day of the siege, I answered the whispers. I did not mean to. I did not plan to. I simply found myself, in a moment of absolute despair, whispering back, not prayers, not pleas, but a simple question that I could not contain any longer. Why? Why is this happening? Why have we been abandoned? And something answered. Not with words, not with sounds, but with a feeling that spread through my chest like warm water. A sense of being seen, of being known, of being valued by something that actually cared about my suffering. It was the first comfort I had felt in months. It was more intoxicating than any drug, more seductive than any pleasure I had ever experienced. It was the hook, it was the first gift, it was the beginning of the end. I did not know it then. I could not have known. But in that moment, I had taken the first step on a path that leads only to 2 destinations, apotheosis or abomination. I was not destined for apotheosis. None of us are. Not truly. The odds are too vast, the competition too fierce, the gods too capricious. For every Abaddon, there are millions of chaos spawn. For every demon prince who ascends to immortality, there are legions of screaming, writhing things that were once men and women, with names and hopes and futures. I know this now. I understand it with a clarity that has come far too late, and I can feel my fingers beginning to fuse together as I speak, can feel the change accelerating, can feel the last fragments of Cardenvoss dissolving into the formless hunger that will soon be all that remains. But I am not done yet. I still have words. I still have memory. And I will use what remains to tell you everything. The gifts, the changes, the slow erosion of self. The terrible moment when you realize what you are becoming and understand that there is no way back. Listen, remember, and for the Emperor's sake, do not make the choices I made. The first gift came 3 days after I answered the whispers. I did not recognize it as a gift at the time. I thought it was merely the stress of combat, the accumulated trauma of months spent in conditions that no human mind was designed to endure. My vision had always been adequate, standard Cadian stock, nothing exceptional. But suddenly I could see in the darkness, could perceive the heat signatures of enemies through walls, could track movement at distances that should have been beyond my capacity. The world had become sharper, clearer, more vivid in ways that I could not explain and did not question. I killed 17 cultists in the hours after my vision changed. 17 enemies who thought themselves hidden, who believed the darkness would protect them, who died with expressions of confusion on their faces because they could not understand how I had found them. My squad looked at me with something between admiration and unease, and I told them that the Emperor had blessed me, that my faith had been rewarded with enhanced perception, that this was proof that we had not been abandoned. I believed it. That is the horror of it. I genuinely believed that what was happening to me was holy, was righteous, was the Emperor's answer to my desperate prayers. The whispers had not announced themselves as servants of the dark gods. They had not demanded worship or sacrifice or any of the obvious signs of corruption. They had simply offered comfort, and then they had delivered a tangible benefit, and my mind, desperate for hope, starving for any evidence that survival was possible, had constructed a narrative that allowed me to accept what was happening without confronting what it truly meant. This is how it works. This is the trap that has claimed billions of souls across 10,000 years of war. The gods do not announce themselves with thunder and flame, do not demand immediate allegiance, do not reveal the true cost of their gifts until it is far too late to refuse them. They are patient, they are subtle, they understand human psychology better than we understand ourselves, for they are made from human psychology, woven from our hopes and fears and desperate needs into intelligences that know exactly which strings to pull and when to pull them. The second gift came a week later. We were overrun. A wave of mutants breached our defensive line, pouring through a gap created when a crack grenade detonated prematurely and killed 4 of our heavy weapons team. I found myself surrounded, my Lazrafal empty, my combat knife in my hand, facing enemies who outnumbered me 7-1. I should have died. By every calculation of combat mathematics, I should have been torn apart in seconds. Instead, I felt something surge through my muscles, a strength that did not belong to me, a speed that exceeded anything my body should have been capable of producing. I moved through those mutants like a blade through cloth, my knife finding throats and eyes, and the soft spaces between ribs with a precision that I had never possessed before. When it was over, when 7 bodies lay twitching at my feet, and their blood steamed in the cold air of the underhive, I stood without a scratch, my heart pounding with exhilaration rather than fear. I told myself it was adrenaline. I told myself it was the survival instinct pushing my body beyond its normal limits. I told myself all the comfortable lies that soldiers tell themselves when they survive encounters that should have killed them, because the alternative, accepting that something inhuman had intervened, that powers I did not understand were investing in my continued existence, was too terrible to contemplate. The changes began to accelerate after that. My muscles grew denser without any change in my training regimen. my endurance extending far beyond what should have been possible given our starvation rations. My reflexes sharpened until I could track individual bolt rounds in flight, until I could dodge attacks that I should not have been able to see coming, until my squad mates began to whisper among themselves about the sergeant who had been touched by something, though they carefully avoided specifying what. My senses expanded beyond human norms. I could smell fear on enemies before I saw them, could hear heartbeats through walls, could taste the chemical composition of the air and know when danger approached. And through it all, the whispers continued. Soft, encouraging, congratulatory. They praised my kills. They celebrated my survival. They assured me that I was special, chosen, destined for greatness beyond anything I had imagined. They spoke of the gods' favor, not by name, never by name, but in terms vague enough that I could continue to interpret their words as imperial blessings, as the emperor's reward for my faithful service. I know how this sounds. I know that you are wondering how anyone could be so blind, so foolish, so willing to deceive themselves in the face of evidence that should have been unmistakable. But you have not spent months in the darkness, have not watched everyone you love die screaming, have not felt the absolute certainty that you have been abandoned by everything you once believed in. Desperation does not merely cloud judgment. It reconstructs reality itself, reshaping perception until the unacceptable becomes acceptable, until the impossible becomes inevitable, until the soul will accept any explanation that allows it to continue functioning. I wanted to believe, and so I believed. The first visible mutation appeared on the 147th day. I woke to find my left hand changed. The fingers had lengthened, the nails had hardened into something closer to claws, and the skin had taken on a greyish hue that no amount of scrubbing could remove. I stared at it for hours, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing, the comfortable lies I had been telling myself crumbling in the face of evidence that could not be explained away. I should have reported it. I should have gone to the commissar and confessed what had been happening, should have accepted the bolt round that would have been my reward, should have died as Carden Voss rather than continuing to live as something that was becoming less human with each passing hour. That would have been the faithful choice. That would have been the honorable choice. I hid it instead. I wrapped my hand in bandages and told anyone who asked that I had been burned in the fighting. I continued to lead my squad, continued to kill the enemies of an emperor I had already betrayed, continued to accept the Whisper's gifts, even as those gifts transformed me into something that would have been executed on sight in any loyal imperial territory. And across the galaxy, I know now, that thousands of others were making the same choices, were walking the same path, were accepting the same gifts and telling themselves the same lies. The Chaos Gods do not rely on single converts. They cast their nets wide, whisper to millions, knowing that only a fraction will answer, knowing that only a fraction of those will prove useful, knowing that the rest will become fodder for their wars, or food for their hunger, or, like me, raw material for the spawn pits that churn endlessly in the Eye of Terror, and every other place where the warp bleeds into reality. We are not special. None of us are special. We are merely the ones who were broken in the right way at the right time, whose desperation aligned with the gods' needs, whose souls were shaped by circumstance into keys that fit locks we never knew existed. The mutations continued to spread. My hand was merely the beginning, the first visible sign of changes that had been accumulating beneath my skin since the moment I first answered the whispers. Within weeks, my entire left arm had transformed, the bones lengthening and thickening, additional joints forming where no joints should exist. the skin splitting and resealing in patterns that seemed almost decorative, almost intentional, as though some artist of flesh was sculpting me into a form that existed only in nightmares. My spine developed ridges that pressed against my uniform. My teeth grew sharper. My eyes began to reflect light in ways that made my squad mates flinch when they caught my gaze in the darkness. I could no longer hide what was happening. I could no longer pretend that I was merely blessed, merely enhanced, merely the recipient of holy gifts from a benevolent emperor. The men I had led for years looked upon me with horror now, with the dawning recognition that their sergeant had become something other, something wrong, something that belonged on the other side of the battle lines. The commissar came for me on the 200th day. He found me in a maintenance alcove, trying to wrap fresh bandages around an arm that had grown too large for any bandage to contain, trying to hide mutations that could no longer be hidden. He stood in the doorway with his bolt pistol raised, his face a mask of disgust and something that might have been pity, and he spoke the words that I had been dreading since the moment I first answered the whispers. "Sergeant Voss, you have been touched by the archenemy. In the name of the Emperor, I pronounce you." He did not finish the sentence. I moved faster than I had ever moved before, faster than any human should be capable of moving, and my clawed hand was around his throat before he could pull the trigger. I felt his windpipe collapse beneath my grip, felt the desperate flutter of his pulse against my palm, felt the light leave his eyes as I squeezed and squeezed until there was nothing left to squeeze. I killed him. I killed the man whose duty it was to save my soul through the mercy of execution, and I felt nothing but relief that I would live another hour, another day, another week, in this form that was becoming less mine with each passing moment. That was when I understood, finally and completely, what I had become. Not a servant of the Emperor, not a blessed soldier, not a man touched by holy gifts, a traitor, a heretic, a thing that had already damned itself and was now merely waiting to see what shape its damnation would take. I fled that night. I left behind the regiment I had served for 19 years, the men who had trusted me to lead them, the Imperium that had raised me from infancy. I fled into the darkness of the underhive, following the whispers that had become my only guides, seeking the cults that I had spent months fighting against. They welcomed me with open arms. They looked upon my mutations and saw beauty. They called me blessed, favored, destined for greatness. And I believed them, because belief was all I had left. The cult called themselves the Children of the Blessed Transformation. They had made their sanctuary in the deepest levels of the underhive, in manufacturum districts that had been abandoned for centuries, where the light of the Imperium had never reached and the Emperor's law held no sway. Thousands of them lived in those rusting cathedrals of industry, worshipping gods whose names they spoke with reverence, offering prayers that would have earned them execution in any loyal territory, dreaming of the day when the gifts they sought would elevate them beyond the limitations of human flesh. I was welcomed as a hero. My mutations, the clawed arm, the ridged spine, the eyes that reflected light like a predator's, were held up as proof of the god's favor, as evidence that transformation was possible, that the flesh could be remade into something greater than the template humanity had been born with. They touched my changed limbs with something like worship, traced the patterns in my altered skin, asked me to tell them again and again about the gifts I had received and how they had manifested. I gave them what they wanted. I told stories of power and transcendence, of enemies struck down and limitations overcome, of the whispers that had guided me through the darkness and delivered me to this place of acceptance. I did not tell them about the commissar whose throat I had crushed. I did not tell them about the nights when I woke screaming. my body reshaping itself in ways I could not control, my mind struggling to remain coherent as something vast and alien pressed against the boundaries of my consciousness. I did not tell them about the fear that had become my constant companion, that gnawed at my sanity in every quiet moment, that whispered, in a voice quite different from the ones that had led me here, that I had made a terrible mistake, that the path I walked led somewhere I did not wish to go. The cult had a hierarchy, as all human organizations do. At its base were the aspirants, men and women who had not yet received the god's attention, who prayed and sacrificed and debased themselves in hope of earning the mutations they believed would mark them as chosen. Above them were the blessed, those like myself who bore visible signs of transformation, who were held up as examples and treated with a deference that bordered on worship. And at the apex, ruling from chambers that even the blessed were forbidden to enter uninvited, were the champions. Warriors who had accumulated so many gifts that they had become something more than human, something terrible and magnificent, something that the aspirants dreamed of becoming, and the blessed secretly feared they might. I met the first champion on my third day in the sanctuary. His name had been Marcus Thorn once. He had been a manufacturing overseer, a man of middle years with a family and a modest hab unit, and all the small ambitions that define ordinary lives. That had been 20 years ago. What stood before me now bore no resemblance to anything that could be called ordinary, anything that could be called human, anything that could be called Marcus Thorn. He was massive, 3 meters tall, his frame swollen with muscle that rippled beneath skin that had become something closer to chitin, his arms ending in appendages that shifted between claws and tentacles, and things I could not name, depending on some internal rhythm I could not perceive. His face was a ruin of features that had been rearranged too many times. Eyes in the wrong places, mouths where eyes should have been, the whole mass constantly in subtle motion, as though the flesh itself could not decide what shape it wished to hold. And yet, somehow, intelligence still gleamed in those misplaced eyes. Will still animated that impossible form, a mind still existed behind the nightmare of mutated tissue. He looked upon me with something that might have been recognition, might have been hunger, might have been pity. "Fresh meat," he said, and his voice was a chorus of tones that should not have been able to emerge from a single throat, harmonics and dissonances layering over each other in patterns that hurt to hear. Still thinking you're special, still believing the gifts mean favor. I did not know how to respond. I stood frozen, my own mutations suddenly feeling very small, very insignificant compared to the monument of transformation that loomed before me. "I was like you once," he continued, and one of his tentacle arms reached out to touch my clawed hand with something that might have been tenderness. Strong, fast, proud of what I was becoming. I thought I was ascending. I thought each gift brought me closer to godhood. He leaned closer, and I could smell him, a scent of blood and rot and something sweeter beneath it, something that made my stomach turn and my mouth water simultaneously. I was wrong, and so are you. He did not explain further. He did not need to. In the weeks that followed, I came to understand what he meant, came to see with my own eyes the truth that the cult's aspirants refused to acknowledge, that the blessed whispered about only in their most private moments, that the champions knew with the certainty of those who have walked too far down a path to ever turn back. The gifts were not steps toward godhood. They were not rewards for faithful service. They were not the gods reaching down to elevate their chosen servants. They were symptoms. They were side effects. They were the visible signs of souls being devoured, of identities being erased, of human beings transformed into something that served the gods' purposes without ever achieving the transcendence they had been promised. I witnessed my first spawn birth in my second month among the children. Her name was Sarah. She had been one of the blessed, a woman whose gifts had manifested as enhanced speed and senses much like my own, whose mutations had been subtle enough that she could almost have passed for human in dim lighting. She had been kind to me in my first days with the cult, had shown me where to sleep and what to eat, had answered my questions with patience and something that might have been friendship. The changes came upon her suddenly, without warning, without the gradual progression that characterized normal mutation. One moment she was standing beside me in the sanctuary's great hall, listening to a sermon on the glories of transformation. The next, she was screaming, a sound that began human and ended as something else entirely, something that contained no words, no meaning, nothing but agony and terror, and the desperate protest of a mind being erased. Her flesh rippled, it bubbled, it tore and reformed in patterns that followed no logic I could perceive, her body becoming clay in the hands of sculptors who cared nothing for human aesthetics, nothing for function, nothing for the person who had once inhabited that form. Bones cracked and regrew in configurations that served no purpose. Organs pushed through skin that could no longer contain them. Eyes multiplied and migrated, mouths opened in places mouths should never be. Limbs split and fused and split again in a cascade of transformation that seemed to have no end. She screamed throughout, even as her throat changed, even as her lungs became something other than lungs. She continued to scream, the sound evolving, mutating, becoming less human with each passing second, until it was nothing but noise. Nothing but the audio equivalent of the visual horror that her body had become. It lasted 7 minutes. I counted. 7 minutes of watching someone I had known, someone I had spoken with, someone who had been a person with thoughts and hopes and fears, reduced to a mass of writhing flesh that retained nothing of who she had been, except perhaps some dim ember of awareness buried so deep that it could never find expression. When it was over, when the transformation had run its course, what remained was not Sarah. It was not human. It was not anything that could be named or categorized or understood by mortal minds. It was simply meat, living meat, animated by impulses that had nothing to do with thought, driven by hungers that had nothing to do with need. It lurched across the hall on limbs that had not existed moments before, and the cultists who had witnessed its birth scattered before it, their faith suddenly seeming very fragile in the face of what their goddess had made of their sister. The champions herded it toward the spawn pens with practiced efficiency. They had done this before. They would do it again. And I understood, watching them guide that mindless horror toward its new home, among others of its kind, that I was looking at my future. I demanded answers after that. I sought out Marcus Thorne in his chambers, and I asked him, with a desperation that I could not hide, what determined who ascended and who fell, what separated the champions from the spawn, what I could do to ensure that I did not end as Sarah had ended. He laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, not mocking, but sad, infinitely sad, the laughter of someone who had asked the same questions and received answers they wished they had never heard. There is no formula, he said, his many mouths speaking in something approaching unison. No ritual, no sacrifice, no deed that guarantees apotheosis. The gods choose as they choose, for reasons we cannot understand, according to whims that shift like the tides of the warp itself. Some who have served for centuries are cast down in an instant. Some who have barely begun their service are elevated to demonhood. And the vast majority, the overwhelming, crushing majority, are reduced to what you saw today. He gestured toward his own transformed body, toward the mass of mutations that had accumulated across 2 decades of service. I have been fortunate. The gifts have come slowly enough that my mind has adapted, that my identity has survived, that I remain Marcus Thorne even as I become something Marcus Thorne could never have imagined. But I feel it with each new gift, with each new change. I feel myself eroding, feel the core of who I am growing smaller as the god's attention grows larger. One day, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps in a decade, the balance will tip. One day, I will receive one gift too many, and what remains of Marcus Thorne will be swept away in the flood. He met my eyes, all of my eyes, for I had begun to develop secondary visual organs along my temples, and in his gaze I saw the truth that he had lived with for 20 years. This is the bargain, Carden Voss. This is what you accepted when you first answered the whispers. Not power in exchange for service, not transcendence in exchange for faith. You gambled your humanity against odds that no sane being would accept, and the house always wins. The house always wins. I left his chambers with the taste of ash in my mouth, and the whispers laughing in my ears. And even then, even knowing what I knew, even having witnessed what I witnessed, I could not stop. The gifts continued to come. The mutations continued to spread. And I continued to accept them, because the alternative, rejecting the god's attention, cutting myself off from the powers that had become my only source of strength, felt like death, felt like surrender, felt like admitting that everything I had sacrificed had been for nothing. I was already drowning. What did it matter if the water rose a little higher? The final battle came 6 months after I joined the Children of the Blessed Transformation. Imperial forces had finally gathered sufficient strength to purge the underhive, to burn out the corruption that had been festering in the depths of Carthax Secundus since the uprising began. They came with 10 regiments of guard, with armoured columns and artillery support, with ministorum priests chanting litanies of hate and commissars executing any who showed the slightest hesitation. They came to kill every one of us, and they did not care how many of their own soldiers died in the process. The cult marshaled its forces for a final stand. Champions who had been rivals for decades fought side by side, their mutations complementing each other in patterns that spoke of some greater design. The Blessed formed war bands around the champions they had sworn to follow, their own gifts weaponized and ready. And the spawn, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, the accumulated failures of generations of worship, were unleashed from their pens and pointed toward the enemy, their mindless hunger finally given purpose. I fought among the Blessed. I killed guardsmen who might have been my brothers, whose uniforms I had once worn with pride, whose oaths I had once shared. My clawed arm tore through flak armor as though it were cloth, my enhanced senses allowing me to anticipate attacks before they came, my body twisted and wrong and no longer entirely my own, moving with a grace and lethality that Carden Voss, the Cadian sergeant, could never have achieved. And through it all, the whispers sang. They sang of blood and glory, of transformation and transcendence, of the gods' favor raining down upon their faithful servants. They sang promises of power beyond imagining, of ascension to heights that mortal minds could not conceive. They sang, and I listened, and I killed, and with each death I felt something change within me, something fundamental shifting, something essential beginning to slip. The battle lasted for 3 days. 3 days of constant fighting, of killing, and dying and killing again, of watching the blessed fall one by one and wondering when my turn would come. The Imperial forces pushed deeper into the Underhive, their numbers seeming endless, their determination unbreakable. We held them at choke points and junctions, made them pay for every meter in blood, but we all knew, blessed and champion alike, that we could not win, that we were merely delaying the inevitable, that the Imperium would not stop until every one of us had been purged from existence. On the third day, the whispers changed. They had always been encouraging, supportive, promising rewards for faithful service. Now they became demanding, insistent, hungry in a way they had never been before. They did not ask, they commanded. They did not suggest, they compelled. And what they commanded, what they compelled, was more. More killing, more bloodshed, more sacrifice, more of everything I had to give, with the implicit understanding that what I had to give included the last fragments of my humanity. I felt the gifts begin to accelerate. New mutations bloomed across my body with a speed that terrified me, that exceeded anything I had experienced in the previous months of transformation. My ribcage cracked and reformed, additional bones pressing outward against skin that stretched and tore and healed in configurations that served no purpose I could understand. My spine extended, vertebrae multiplying, a tail beginning to form where no tail had any right to exist. My skull shifted, the plates grinding against each other, making room for growths that pushed upward from my brain, or what had once been my brain, seeking exit through bone that was becoming as mutable as clay. I understood what was happening. I had witnessed it with Sarah. I had been warned by Marcus Thorne. The balance had tipped. The gifts had accumulated past some threshold that could not be crossed without consequence. And now the consequence was coming for me. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I tried to flee. Emperor, forgive me. I tried to run, not toward the Imperial lines, not toward the death that would at least have been clean, but away from the battle entirely, into the deeper darkness of the Underhive where I might find some corner in which to hide, some moment of peace in which to process what was happening to me. But my body would not obey. My legs carried me toward the enemy, not away. My arms raised weapons I did not remember picking up. My mouth opened and sounds emerged. War cries in languages I had never spoken. Prayers to gods whose names I had never learned. Words that burned in my throat and left the taste of blood and copper in their wake. I was no longer in control. I was no longer Carden Voss, making choices and acting on them. I was a vessel, a puppet, a thing, being, piloted by forces that had been waiting for this moment since I first answered their whispers in the darkness of the siege. The kills came faster now, each one feeding something that had taken root in my soul, each death adding fuel to a fire that was consuming me from within. I lost count. I lost track. I lost the ability to distinguish between enemies and allies, between targets and obstacles, between the living and the dead. Everything was meat. Everything was fuel. Everything existed only to be destroyed, and I was the instrument of that destruction. And somewhere deep inside the shrinking core of what remained of my consciousness, I was screaming. I do not know how long it lasted. Time had lost all meaning, had become as mutable as my flesh, stretching and compressing according to rhythms that the gods alone understood. I know only that at some point, some eternal, terrible point that might have been minutes or hours or days, I found myself standing in a chamber filled with corpses, surrounded by the remnants of a battle I could not remember fighting. My body so changed that I could no longer recognize it as the body I had been born with. I had 4 arms now, or perhaps 5. The boundaries between limbs had become unclear, appendages splitting and merging in ways that made counting impossible. My skin had become a patchwork of textures and colors, some human, some chitinous, some covered in scales or fur or substances I could not name. My face, I could feel my face, could feel the features sliding and reforming with each breath, could feel eyes opening and closing in patterns that had nothing to do with my will. And the worst part, the part that breaks something in me, even now, even as I struggle to hold these final thoughts together, was that I could still think. I could still remember. I could still understand what was happening to me, could still feel the horror and the grief and the desperate, futile wish that I had made different choices. The spawn I had seen, the mindless things that lurched and killed without awareness, they were the lucky ones. They had been erased entirely, their consciousness swept away by the flood of transformation, leaving behind only hunger and instinct and the empty peace of non-existence. But I remained, diminished, eroding, losing more of myself with each passing moment, but still present, still aware, still Carden Voss in some small, shrinking way. I do not know why. The gods' cruelty, perhaps, a final punishment for the presumption of believing I was special, of thinking the gifts meant favor, of imagining that I might be one of the ones who ascended rather than fell. Or perhaps there is no reason, no purpose, no meaning. Perhaps the universe simply does not care about the suffering of those who have already damned themselves, and my continued awareness is nothing more than random chance, a quirk of how the mutations happen to manifest in my particular flesh. It does not a matter. Meaning is a luxury for those who still have futures. I found this recording device among the corpses, a data slate, military issue, probably belonging to some guardsman whose face I cannot remember destroying. It still functions, though my fingers, what remain of my fingers, struggle to operate the interface, though the voice that emerges from my throat barely sounds like speech anymore. I am using what time remains to me, what coherence remains to me, to speak these words, to leave this testimony, to ensure that someone, somewhere, might understand what happened to Carden Voss and why. The transformation continues even now. I can feel it in every cell of my body, feel the relentless pressure of change that will not stop until there is nothing left to change, until the last fragment of my identity has been dissolved into the formless chaos that the gods find so amusing. My thoughts are becoming harder to hold, harder to shape into words, harder to connect to each other in patterns that make sense. Soon, very soon, I will lose even this, will become what Sarah became, what thousands of others have become, what the gods always intended for me from the moment I first answered their whispers. I want to say that I regret it. I want to say that if I could go back, I would make different choices, would accept the Commissar's mercy, would die as a servant of the Emperor, rather than live as a slave to the things that devour souls. But I do not know if that is true. I do not know if the man I was, desperate, afraid, abandoned in the darkness, could have chosen differently. I do not know if anyone, faced with the same circumstances, would have had the strength to refuse what was offered. I know only that I failed. I know only that the price of my failure is this horror, this dissolution, this slow erasure of everything I ever was or hoped to be. The whispers are growing louder now. They are no longer words, no longer promises, no longer anything that resembles communication. They are simply noise, the sound of hunger, the sound of consumption, the sound of gods laughing at the folly of a mortal who thought he could gamble with powers beyond his comprehension and somehow come out ahead. I can feel my mind beginning to fragment, can feel the thoughts that have sustained this testimony starting to scatter like leaves in a wind that blows from dimensions I cannot perceive. I do not have much time left. Let me tell you, while I still can, what it feels like. Let me give you this final gift, the truth of what awaits those who walk the path I walked, spoken by one who is experiencing it even now, who can feel the last walls crumbling, who knows that the next few moments will be his last as anything resembling a human being. Let me tell you what it feels like to become a chaos spawn. It feels like drowning in yourself. Imagine every memory you have ever formed, every thought you have ever thought, every emotion you have ever felt. Imagine all of it becoming liquid, becoming fluid, losing the boundaries that separated one experience from another. Imagine your childhood mixing with your adulthood, your loves mixing with your hates, your hopes mixing with your fears, until you can no longer tell which is which, until the concept of which itself loses meaning, until you are simply sensation without source, experience without experiencer, a churning sea of consciousness with no shore in sight. This is what I feel. This is what I am becoming. My name is Carden Voss. I repeat this to myself with every breath that my changing lungs still permit. Cling to it like a drowning man clings to driftwood, knowing that eventually the waves will tear it from my grasp, but refusing to let go until they do. My name is Carden Voss. I was a sergeant. I served the Emperor. I betrayed him. I made choices that led me here. My name is Carden Voss. My name is Carden Voss. My name is... The words are becoming harder to hold. They slip through the cracks in my mind like water through broken fingers, and each time I reach for them, I find a little less. Find the meaning draining away. Find the sounds that once represented identity becoming merely sounds. Arbitrary vibrations with no more significance than the wet noises my transforming flesh makes as it continues its endless reshaping. I can feel my body now only as distant pressure, as sensations that no longer map to anything I understand. There is movement, constant movement, limbs that are no longer limbs reaching and grasping and coiling according to impulses that do not originate in anything I would recognize as will. There is hunger, vast, formless hunger that has no object, that wants without wanting, that drives without directing. There is something that might once have been pain, but has become so constant, so pervasive, so woven into every instant of existence that it no longer registers as pain, merely as the baseline state of being, the new normal of a consciousness that is forgetting what normal ever meant. And beneath it all, growing stronger as everything else grows weaker, there is the noise. The whispers have merged into a single sound, a roar that contains every voice that has ever spoken in the warp, every scream that has ever echoed through the immaterium, every laugh and cry and prayer and curse of every soul that has ever been claimed by the gods. It fills the space where my thoughts used to be, crowds out the memories that once defined me, erases the boundaries between self and other, until I can no longer tell if I am one being or many, if the hunger I feel is mine or belongs to something vast that has worn me like a glove and is now discarding me as it moves on to other vessels. I try to hold on. Emperor, help me. I try. I think of my mother's face, but the image wavers, distorts, becomes something with too many eyes and not enough mercy. I think of my first day in the guard. But the memory twists, the faces of my squad mates melting into the faces of those I killed, until I cannot remember which were friends and which were enemies, and whether there was ever truly a difference. I think of the prayers I learned as a child, but the words come out wrong, come out backwards. come out in languages I never learned, that taste of blood and ash and the particular sweetness of souls being devoured. There is less of me now than there was when I began this testimony. I can measure it somehow, can feel the volume of my consciousness shrinking, the space I occupy in my own mind growing smaller as the thing I am becoming grows larger. Soon there will be nothing left. Soon the last spark of Carden Voss will be extinguished, and what remains will lurch and kill and feed without ever knowing that it was once a man, without ever remembering that it once had a name, without ever understanding that it was once capable of understanding. This is mercy, perhaps, the final mercy of the gods, extended to those they have used and discarded. Not the mercy of death, but the mercy of forgetting, the erasure of awareness so complete that suffering itself becomes impossible, because suffering requires a self to suffer, and there will be no self left to suffer, only meat and hunger, and the endless, purposeless continuation of existence without meaning. But I am not there yet. Not quite. And in these final moments, as the walls close in and the light grows dim, and the name I have clung to begins to dissolve like salt in an infinite ocean, I want to say something that matters. I want to leave behind something more than horror, more than warning, more than the chronicle of a fool's damnation. I want to tell you about the moment when I could have chosen differently. It was not when I first answered the whispers. By then, I was already broken, already desperate, already so far gone that the choice was no choice at all. It was not when I killed the commissar, though that was when I knew myself damned. It was not when I fled to the cult, or when I accepted their welcome, or when I watched Sarah transformed and did not run. It was earlier, so much earlier that I did not recognize it as a choice at the time. It was the moment on Carthax Secundus, in the earliest days of the siege, when I first felt despair. Not the despair itself, that was inevitable, given what we faced, but the moment when I surrendered to it, the moment when I stopped believing that resistance was possible, that hope had meaning, that the Emperor's light could reach even into the darkness where we fought and bled and died. That was when I opened the door. That was when I created the crack through which the whispers would eventually enter. That was the choice, not a dramatic rejection of faith, not a conscious embrace of heresy, but a quiet, private surrender that felt like nothing at the time and proved to be everything in the end. The gods do not need you to worship them. They do not need your prayers or your sacrifices or your conscious devotion. They need only your despair. They need only the moment when you stop believing in anything else, when you become so empty that their whispers are the only thing left to fill the void. And once they have that, once they have found the crack in your soul, they will pour themselves through it with a patience that spans millennia, reshaping you so slowly that you do not notice until it is far, far too late. I could have chosen hope, even false hope, even desperate hope, even hope that was nothing more than stubbornness in the face of certain doom. I could have held to the Emperor's light, not because I believed it would save me, but because holding to it was better than the alternative, because faith is a wall and despair is a door, and I was too tired to see the difference until the door had already opened. This is what I want you to know. This is the only wisdom I have to offer, purchased at a price that cannot be calculated in any currency that matters. Do not despair. Whatever darkness surrounds you, whatever horrors you face, whatever impossible odds stand between you and survival, do not despair. Rage, if you must. Weep, if you must. Curse the universe and everything in it, if that is what you need to continue. But do not despair. Do not surrender that innermost core of self that believes, against all evidence, that resistance has meaning, that light exists somewhere beyond the darkness, that you are more than meat for the gods to consume. This is the only armor that truly matters. This is the only weapon that cannot be turned against you. This is the difference between those who fall and those who endure, between those who become spawn and those who die with their humanity intact. I wish I had understood this sooner. I wish I had been stronger. I was not. And now the words are failing. The thoughts are scattering. The name I held is slipping away, becoming sounds without meaning, identity without anchor, self without. I was. There was a man once. He had a name. He made choices. He became something else. Hunger, movement, the absence of everything that once mattered. There is no more testimony. There is no more witness. There is only what remains when humanity has been stripped away, when consciousness has been drowned in chaos, when the gods have taken everything and left behind nothing but appetite and motion, and the endless screaming silence where a soul used to be. This data slate will be found, perhaps. These words will be heard, perhaps. And someone, somewhere, might understand what happened to the man who recorded them, might take warning from his fate, might choose hope where he chose despair. Or perhaps not. Perhaps this testimony will be lost, corrupted, destroyed. Another voice swallowed by the darkness, another warning that went unheard. It does not matter anymore. Nothing matters anymore. The man who could have cared is gone. Only the spawn remains.